So, the Rake is a famous creepypasta from 2006 about a strange creature in North America resembling a naked man. If you're familiar with any aspect of the story at all, it would probably be this picture. And I mean, yeah, it's a pretty spooky picture. But why is it that the text falls by the wayside? The same is true for other creepypastas like Jeff the Killer. The picture lives on, but the text doesn't. Like, do you know what the Rake even does? What its deal is? I would imagine you don't. The history of the Rake is an interesting one. According to the Creepypasta Files wiki, the character was created on 4chan by a group of people who simply wanted to make their own monster. That was in late 2005, and by mid-2006, Brian Somerville wrote the story that would become the famous creepypasta. Now, a couple of things to note. If you've seen Davis Morgan's creepypasta videos, you'll likely see that this one is similar, especially in regards to nitpicking. I want to shout out Davis's channel here, be sure to watch his videos if you haven't already. But like Davis, I want to emphasize that I'm not doing this to make fun of Brian Somerville, or mock his art, or claim he's a bad artist, or anything like that. I am going to critique the story, but only as a demonstration of how we all start somewhere and how we can all improve. Yo guys, it's me, Jonah, editing this video. Like Davis, I should also point out, I don't consider myself an expert in any regard. I'm just some guy on the internet with opinions, so don't take my word as gospel in any sense. Okay, back to the video. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the text. So interestingly, the story on Creepypasta's official site has a bit of a prelude that I don't see in other versions of the story, like on the Creepypasta wiki. I'm not sure if these first two paragraphs were originally part of the story or if they were added down the line. But for the sake of the video, we'll include them in the critique. The opening sentence reads, "As the sun begins to set and the trees huddle together in small dark groups as if shielding themselves against the coming of night, you step quietly and quickly through the carpet of fallen leaves and stray twigs, recognizing and noting as you do every rustle, every snap of a branch created by your own footfalls." So taking the first sentence alone, this is just way too long and honestly not a great hook. I do like some of the figurative language here, particularly how the trees huddle together. That's kind of neat. But what is it you want from a story? You want a story. The action should be front and center, not couched in the language. So while this isn't always the case, you often want to avoid starting sentences with the word as, and you really want to avoid gerunds, as they take away from the punch behind the verb. The verbs are the action. Of course, these are very easy mistakes to make, and I make them all the time. We could rewrite this first sentence, simplify things, and break it up into multiple sentences, as these actions are clearly begging for some room to breathe. The sun begins to set and the trees huddle together in small groups as if afraid of the oncoming night. You step quietly and quickly through the carpet of fallen leaves and stray twigs. You note every rustle and snap beneath your feet. And honestly, this isn't perfect either, this is just my initial crack at a rewrite. I'm not sure I even like the simile, to be honest, even though I do like the visual of trees huddling together. It just goes to show how tight you can make your own writing. The first paragraph continues, "You note them so that you can distinguish them from the other sounds, the soft rustlings of leaves, the crack of bracken somewhere behind you." Setting aside that we just used the word rustle in the previous sentence, this does create at least some intrigue. But that's where one of my biggest problems with this opening paragraph comes up. What is the context here? Why is the you in this paragraph even going through the woods in the first place? Are they looking for the Rake? If they are, that would be helpful to know. But based on how the rest of the paragraph reads, it doesn't sound that way. Maybe you don't think the reason is a big deal. This is all just introduction after all. But hold that thought, as that's where my real biggest problem comes into play. The intro goes on. "You increase your speed, knowing that night is not the only thing drawing closer. The sound increases as your pace and heartbeats quicken. You turn, and in the fading light catch a single glimpse of the hunched, crawling thing that is pursuing you, creeping forward like an animal and yet looking so horribly human. You only caught a single glimpse, but then you start to run. One glimpse is enough." There are a few problems here. For one thing, there's the back-to-back use of the word increase in these two sentences. Replacing one would have been all too easy. Then there's the pluralizing of heartbeats when it could have been singular. Perhaps most egregiously here is the use of past tense when the rest of the paragraph is present tense. And I understand why it's past tense, but it would still read just fine, better even in my opinion, if it was just left in present tense with the rest. You only catch a glimpse. but then you start to run. One glimpse is enough. There's also the incorrect use of a comma in our last sentence. One glimpse is enough. It seems like whoever wrote this section really wanted the reader to pause there, and they sacrificed convention to make it happen. Sometimes that sort of thing is okay, but you have to be really careful about that. These are the kinds of things editors will flag as amateurish. The next paragraph is what makes me doubt this little intro is truly part of the text. Overview. Mostly associated with the image of a bald, pale-skinned creature hunched at an angle with bright, orb-like eyes staring into the camera, the Rake has become a staple creepypasta monster, adopted by many authors as shorthand for a creature resembling the one depicted in the photo and placed in various settings. Here, the story gets oddly kind of self-referential. And that, again, makes me think this isn't supposed to be part of the story at all. That sounds like an actual overview for the convenience of the reader. This bit takes place outside the fictional version of our world where the actual story takes place. And that's my biggest issue with this intro. See, on paper, The Rake is actually a very interestingly constructed story. If you weren't aware, the story is written as a compilation of personal accounts throughout history. Each account, supposedly, details an encounter with the Rake. But that just makes the intro all the more confusing. While each account in the story has at least some context, what am I supposed to make of this opener? Is this like poetry that someone's written about the Rake? You can tell me I'm nitpicking, but I really think this intro takes away from how interesting and unique the rest of this story is. So let's set these two paragraphs aside and really get into the actual story. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Okay, so I feel we have a similar problem that we did in the second-person opening. Even though this setup is quite interesting, the first sentence is just too long and clunky. Punctuating that clunkiness is the passive voice at the end of the sentence. An apparent blackout was enacted. I get that the author is trying to say that someone or something was personally responsible for the blackout, but that's just a weird way to phrase it. No one phrases things like that. And let me be clear, passive voice has its use cases. You will see me use it multiple times in this video, but this is not one of those cases. Even if the speaker suspects someone triggered the blackout, writing it like this makes it sound very unnatural. The second sentence uses passive voice a little more successfully in my opinion, but I'd still probably rephrase that first use. Rather than little or no information was left intact, we could say little or no information remained. That would give us a better construction, and it would make the next use of passive voice feel less repetitive. The story continues. Primarily focused in rural New York State, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. There's one thing here I didn't mention while looking at the last paragraph. One of the more interesting features of this story, in my opinion, is the repeated implication that someone or something is trying to cover up the existence of the Rake. But the problem with this paragraph is that it sort of promises more than what the story actually delivers. It says some witnesses experienced playfulness and curiosity, but we don't actually see that in the text. That's classic telling versus showing. I'll explain more after this next paragraph. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. This sounds really interesting, but then we only get like 4 excerpts, 4 alleged experiences with the Rake. I understand that the author of the story didn't want to write a whole book, but I don't know, I would have liked more, especially given how unexplained the Rake is. But again, we'll talk about that more later. Let's get into the first account. A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not come here again at the request of the Rake. Okay, so here's the challenge of writing a story like this. Supposedly, all these accounts come from different people. So, is the author going to be able to make them all sound different? Now, the author has some advantage in the sense that the rake, as we'll discover, creates similar effects in its victims. Admittedly, I appreciate this section for how short and simple the sentences are. Super easy to follow, the writing is not getting in the way of the substance at all. But another issue here is that this excerpt is supposed to be from 1691. But is that the vibe we get? Is this how people would have written back then? Even in the late 1600s, words we know as common today were spelled differently. You could argue that the English here has been simplified, especially since our next section is translated from Spanish, but it would have been nice if the text told us that. Also, I just want to take a moment to say this. The story on the Creepypasta wiki puts these accounts in chronological order, whereas on Creepypasta's own website, the accounts are seemingly random. I decided to go chronologically for no other reason than it makes my brain feel better. The next account reads, a journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand, I will not sleep. His voice, unintelligible text. This is kind of neat. Again, I question if this accurately reflects writing of the 1880s, especially Spanish writing, but I'm no expert. This could be accurate, I'm not sure. His wet hand is a pretty unique detail, and the text becoming unintelligible is interesting, even if it kind of feels like a cop-out. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't have strong feelings about this section. More details might have been nice, but whatever. The next excerpt reads, a suicide note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Linny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. Again, I kind of just find myself wanting more detail here. And given the address for Linny, I feel the speaker would want to include more detail too, so that Linny would know what to expect, no? What's more, on the writing level, I dislike the repeated use of once I awoke, even though the rake seems to create repetition in its victims. You might argue that anyone in the real world could write like that, but I don't think it makes for very engaging writing in a story. You can write a story with an edge of realism while still making it engaging. After that, we get one of the modern-day witness accounts. From a Witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids straight to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up, thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. Okay, pause real quick. I imagine this is sort of how the author writes generally, lengthier sentences with fewer hard stops. That style can certainly work under the right circumstances, but take that last sentence. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. Those are a lot of verbs to track in one sentence. Even just writing it as such might be easier to track. At about 4 a.m., I woke up. Period. I thought my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. In my opinion, keeping track of your verbs takes a load off the reader's mental weight. But let's carry on with the story. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he was out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed, so quickly, his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. Another pause. This paragraph uses the phrase out of bed, then in the next sentences uses the phrase of the bed twice. Vary your phrases for your reader's interest. We could change this to read, I apologized. I told him I thought he'd gotten up. He turned to face me, gasped, and pulled his feet up. His knee almost knocked me out of the bed. Notice how I'm trying to tighten up the language, giving more strength to the verbs, and varying up the sentence structure where I can. I hope that comes through. Again, this is just a preliminary attempt at editing on my part. The story continues. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. I can't help feeling the speaker is changing tone quite frequently here. We go from them using the phrase, or something, very colloquially, to using the phrase, I was somewhat under the assumption. I don't know, I can't help feeling those two phrases are internally inconsistent with each other. Personally, I would just get rid of or something and other indeterminate language like that. I know it makes the speaker sound like a real person, but it also sort of undermines them as a speaker. That is, it undermines their confidence in what they witnessed, which I can't imagine any horror author wants. I often advise authors get rid of words like something in their writing because it's just too generic and imprecise. It doesn't lend any authority to the writing. And as for the other phrase I pointed out, I was somewhat under the assumption, I would heavily edit that too. Maybe something like, at that point, I almost felt the need to help him. There are some other phrases that need some smoothing out too. Our opening sentence begins with a gerund again. Compare after adjusting to the dark with my eyes adjusted to the dark. Which one sounds more immediate, more like you're actually in a story? Then there's the phrase, I was able to see, which is just so clunky. Again, if you make that verb more immediate and just write, I saw, we would all be better off for it. I would also get rid of phrases like what appeared to be and some sort, again because they're just too indeterminate. But let's move on. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, it scrambled around the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of way, right along the covers until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. It was completely silent for about 30 seconds, probably closer to 5, but it seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. It then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' rooms. You can probably already imagine what commentary I have about this section, but this is where the limitations of this writing style really start to show. We have some real action that's happening now. The heart rates should be spiking at this point, but it's honestly kind of hard to follow given the lengthy sentences and multiple verb forms. As one of my MFA advisors put it, the hotter the action, the cooler the language. It's a little hard to track what's happening here because the language isn't cool enough. What's more, the parenthetical again undermines the speaker here, and takes away from how hot this scene should be. Moving on. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop this thing before it hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. It turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. Once more, I find this all very hard to track. A lot is happening here, and the lack of spatial awareness doesn't help either. I don't really have any idea of what this interior looks like. The hallway is over 20 feet long, and the rake is covered in blood, meaning it already attacked Clara, right? So how fast was it actually moving? The parents scrambled out of bed and ran into the hall, and that was enough time for the rake to go 20 feet down the hall, into Clara's room, attack her, then come out of the room covered in blood? Am I following this all correctly? I'm not sure, because again, this language makes it difficult to follow the action. I do also want to note that violence against young people is kind of a cheap shot in these stories to amp up the scare factor. We also saw plenty of that in the 2-sentence horror stories we took a look at. But anyhow, more action follows. The creature ran down the stairs as my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. That is a lot to happen in just 4 sentences. But at the very least, I did find these sentences much easier to follow than those before. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. Alright, there again we get the insinuation of some kind of cover-up, which interests me once more, and we press on. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house after we decided to return home. I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got into contact and talked about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now referred to as the Rake. It took the four of us 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believe to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, then never mentioned again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. Pause. I sort of find myself feeling this narrator simply should have been the narrator of the story. The sole narrator. They could have opened with the accounts we already read, then shared their own. By adding yet another narrator who knows about all these separate accounts, I feel like we're needlessly complicating things. Of course, you may disagree. The next few sentences again display some of that clunkiness we've observed so far. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. So again, you can tell me I'm nitpicking too hard here, but I'm just not entirely sure how the conclusion follows here. When the speaker says the Rake visited the same subject multiple times, we kind of just have to take their word for it. It would have been nice to have seen that from their perspective, like if they had found evidence of previous Rake visits after the Rake showed itself to them. And speaking to the daughter doesn't count, because given how fast everything played out, the Rake very well could have said those words to the daughter the night of, not beforehand. I hope I'm making myself clear. We continue. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night every night for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. That sentence there further illustrates the trouble with long sentences that might get away from us. So the speaker is saying they went through the footage each day upon waking up. But given the construction, it makes it sound like rolling around in my bed is what happened each day upon waking up. The story concludes, by the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. It still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. The end of any horror story is hard to nail, and I'm not sure how I feel about this one. I think I like the paranoia the speaker feels, and yet things don't quite feel conclusive enough. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But speaking of things that don't feel very conclusive, I kind of feel like I just don't know enough about the Rake at all, despite reading the whole story about him. Like, what abilities does it really have? What are its aims? Like, I'm just not sure I get it, which leaves me unsatisfied as a reader. But all that being said, I think the real beauty of a story like this is how it encourages readers to write their own experiences, historical or modern, of other Rake encounters, which is kind of cool. Of course, I can't say I've seen much literature about the Rake over the years. Oh well, at least the image and idea live on, right? I feel like I should have a grander conclusion here, but I don't. What do you think of the story? What do you think of its legacy? What did you think of my critique? Please tell me everything. I'm so eager to hear your thoughts. As always, I want to take this time to thank my patrons. I truly could not do what I do without them. You're seeing their names on screen right now. If you want to see videos early, get access to the community Discord, receive priority review for your work on the 2nd channel, or if you just like what I do here and want to support, you can consider donating to my Patreon too. But more than anything, I just thank you for watching. If you want to go the extra mile, you can like, comment, hype, subscribe, all that basic stuff. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft.